you need lesson 10, raise your hand and Nate will flag Nate down and he will get you one. Lesson 10, we'll talk about Judas today. Next, so we'll talk about Judas today and on Wednesday. We have Bible class. If you're visiting with us, we have Bible class at 7 o'clock on Wednesday. We'll look at the second half of this lesson. And just as a teaser, I really want us to talk about Judas and free will and prophecy and some stuff like that on Wednesday night. We won't talk about that today. Next Sunday, we begin talking about the Apostle Paul. I say begin. There's so much about him that we actually are going to study him 2 weeks. And then I believe we'll have 2 more lessons after that till the end of the quarter about the apostles. So we're going to go ahead and hand out lesson 11A. You'll notice 11A is, there will be a B on the Apostle Paul. And then I have to begin with a confession, okay? Which is going to ask you to be patient with me. So I struggle with Judas's name. There's some kind of weird mental block that I have, and maybe you have already noticed it, maybe not. In fact, I try not to say Judas's last name. Robin points out to me that I mispronounce it almost all the time. I think I grew up probably goofing around with his name. Judas is a carrot, okay, which probably implanted very early on, like those baby ducks, you know, that follow their mother. And now I struggle to pronounce his last name as, I should hand the microphone to Robin, Judas Iscariot. Is that right? Close enough? Judas Iscariot. It's the best, right, she can say it. It sounds the same to me. But so maybe I'll just say Judas I, and we'll all, or I, and then we'll all be happy. So I apologize for that. And if, I'll just tell you, he is not a carrot. And so if it comes out that way, it's just a problem that I have. That's my confession for the day. To this day, the name Judas has a general negative connotation of a betrayer, of somebody who is just somebody who stabbed you in the back. Even people who don't know about Judas in the Bible, even people who don't know his story may know that he was a betrayer of some type, even if they don't know exactly what he did. But in our vocabulary, if we just say, you know, you're a Judas, it's not good. Now, we've gotten far enough away that there are some Judases around, some famous Judases. And so I'm not saying that it is just always a negative connotation in every case. But we'll talk today and on Wednesday about why this is in the Bible and what he did and maybe why he did it. And like I said, on Wednesday, we're going to talk a little bit about what happened and free will and some of the prophecy and some of the things like that, and what he did, how he coped with or didn't cope with what he did, and what he maybe could have done if his heart was right. So just like the other 12, he is listed in all of the lists of the apostles except the one in Acts chapter 1, because by Acts chapter 1, he's dead. So, and we talked about that on Sunday, that he was replaced by who? Matthias, okay. And there's some things that are said about him in Acts chapter 1 that we will talk about, I believe, on another time. In every case where he's mentioned, there is something about his betrayal. Judas betrayed him. And so much so that on one occasion, it actually, when we're talking about another Judas, it says Judas, not him. I won't say his last name, okay? So he's always identified as the betrayer, even early on. Even in the early lists of the apostles, before he betrays Jesus. So you know the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written before, they're written after the betrayal. Okay, so they're looking back on the life, looking back on the events, and occasionally you get a hint of that, oh, they're writing and mentioning some stuff that's going to happen. For example, Judas, the betrayer. So you know, it's a kind of a teaser, but also a spoiler of what he's going to do. I suspect that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are actually written to people who, for the most part, are Christians and know the story. But it is codifying it. It is making sure that the story doesn't evolve. And it is helping them be grounded in what they already believe. Turn over to the book of John. Somebody look at John chapter 6. And somebody else turn to John chapter 13. John 6:71. Who has that? Let's read that together. Let's find out who this guy is. We know a little bit more about him. John 6:71. Yes. Go ahead, Savannah.
He spoke of Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12.
So who is he? The son of Simon. We don't know who this Simon is. So it's not extremely helpful to us, but it is helpful to the people who knew Jesus. I'll talk a little bit about knew Judas. Let me just mention more about that in just a minute. Somebody who has 13:2. Robin?
And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him.
Yep, give her a chance to pronounce it the right way for me. So here we have him as the son of Simon. We mentioned when we talked about Simon Peter that there's bunches of Simons. It was a very popular name. And here we've got, this is not Simon Peter, obviously. This is a different Simon who is Judas's dad. We don't know too much about it. Let me just mention something in passing, and that is in the scriptures, when things like this are mentioned and we don't know a lot more about it, I believe the reason that it's mentioned is for the benefit of people then who knew Judas, but it's also giving us what you would say when you're telling a story that's true. You give details that Jesus went and he was tired, that the people feeding the 5,000 sat down in green grass. Why tell that kind of stuff? The Passover was near. There's a lot of things like that we're going, what difference does that make? Sometimes it does make a difference, but I think it helps us see the historical aspect of these stories. They're telling a story like you would tell. We're driving down the road and the trees were beautiful. Wait a minute, get to it. You're going to your grandma's house. Don't tell me about the trees. No, that's not what we do. We get pulled into the story and people are telling us these details. A lot of times they're superfluous. They don't have anything to do with grandma, but that's how we tell real events. And these stories are real events, historical events, and they're telling us details like this guy. We have his last name, we have his dad's name, because that's what we do. It was probably more helpful to them, not this Judas, not this Judas, this guy, Simon's his dad. And so anyway, so we have more about his last name. We have some about his dad. One thing that's maybe interesting to you is that Judas is the Greek form of his name. The Hebrew form is, anybody want to take a guess or read ahead? What's the Hebrew form? It's Judah. So he has a name after one of the sons, one of the 12 sons, one of the 12 tribes. And he's wearing that name. By the way, sometimes the name Judah or Judas is translated to modern English, Jude. We have a book of Jude in Revelation, so we have a book of Jude. That's the book of Judah. That's the book of not this Judas, okay? Written by a different Jude. We know that for sure because he's going to kill himself. But anyway, interesting that some of these names sometimes, we're going to see this with Paul next Sunday when his name is changed to Saul, and he's known so much by the Greek form, Paul, that we lose track of the Hebrew name sometimes. So this is Judas, or Judah. He probably grew up with his kids calling him Judah, maybe Jude. Any questions about who he is? That's all we pretty much know about his background, or comments? Just real quick, there are a bunch of other Judases in the New Testament who are not our Judas, the betrayer. They're translated various different ways. There's the guy who's Judas, not Iscariot, one of the 12. We mentioned him when we talked about him earlier. There's a typographical error in your outline. In number 2A, that shouldn't say Acts 6:16. It should say Luke 6:16. So, but anyway, there's Judas called Barsabas. He's mentioned. This is not the same Judas. There's Judas of Galilee in Acts chapter 5. He was a rebel, not a Christian. And so sometimes there are completely different people who are historical people that aren't even Christians. There's Judas of Galilee. Oh, I already mentioned him. Judas in Damascus. That's when we'll see on Sunday when Saul of Tarsus is converted. He goes to Damascus and he's staying in the house of somebody whose name is Judas. Not our same Judas, but it's Acts chapter 9. Did I make a mistake?
I think that verse where it says not one of the 12, not Iscariot, is in John 14:22. In Luke 6:16, it says Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became the translator.
Okay. Yeah, so now I have a typographical error of my typographical error. Okay,
The traitor, must have became a traitor.
yep. So it should be John what?
14:22.
14:22. John 14:22, where it says Acts 6:16 in number 2a. Thank you for that. So there's Judas in Damascus, and then there's Judas, the brother of Jesus, who's also called Jude. That's a whole nother interesting study. The siblings of Jesus, and so that's in Matthew 13 and Mark chapter 6, where Jesus's brothers, even sisters, are mentioned, and Judas is one of those. So there is a bunch of them that are kind of interesting to see that. That's why we have to delineate this guy is the one that we're talking about. Look over here at John chapter 12, 1 through 8. Other than appearing in some lists in the apostles and the specific betrayal events, the only other time that Judas is mentioned specifically by name is in John chapter 12. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with this event. There is what happens we're maybe familiar with, but Judas's comments here and what is said about him may not be very familiar to you. So let's go ahead and read that. John chapter 12. Who would read 1 through 8 for us? Okay, Cody.
6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself what was put into it. Jesus said, Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me.
So there's some strange aspects of this. Some of them are cultural that might be hard for us to really understand. So it's 6 days before the Passover. So Jesus is going to die during the Passover. Jesus knows it. Jesus has been trying to help his apostles be prepared and understand this. They don't at this point. They're at whose house? Lazarus' house, okay. I love the phrase, who had been dead. So I love that phrase. We've talked about him before. Actually, the Jewish leadership struggling with Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. The whole story is fascinating. The whole discussion that Jesus has with Mary and Martha when he shows up is super important. Talks about the resurrection, not just Lazarus, but our own resurrection. Go back and read that sometime. It's really powerful. It's, I think, really helpful in understanding why Jesus came and what his mission was. Also, demonstration of his power. So what's interesting is Judas was present for that, by the way. This is important. Judas was present for that. And now they're back at the house. Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Lazarus is alive. They're reclining at supper. And Lazarus was there. Martha is doing what? Serving, okay. Yeah, there's a whole other story behind that. Martha is serving. Mary is... So she's at the feet of Jesus, okay, which we find her there on another occasion. And what does she do? Kate, what does she do? This is a little weird, okay, so, but still, what does she do? Do what? She anoints Jesus' feet. Somebody describe it a little bit more in detail for me. That's not a big deal. Anointing people's feet, washing their feet, anointing their feet with some kind of, we would say, like spice or lotion or something like that. In this case, it's an ointment of some kind. It's not particularly weird. It would not have been super, strange, I suppose. What else do we know about this case? Yeah, Cody.
It was like very expensive. Whatever the one was really expensive, and she uses her hair to wipe it on Jesus.
Right. So it's very expensive. Let's talk about that first. How expensive is it? What does Judas say?
300 denarii.
Yeah, 300 denarii. Anybody know about what that would have been back then? I don't mean in dollars necessarily. It's hard to calculate. 1 denarii, a day's wage, okay? 300, almost a year's wage, Judas says, okay? I suppose, I'm not a perfume expert, but I suppose that there is perfume out there that is way more expensive than that. I don't know, maybe. Because almost a year's wage would be a lot of money. I hear about some other stuff that gets sold that is crazy. I just heard somebody, I think, had shared a picture of $1,000 steak that one restaurant was selling. And so it's the world we live in. It's kind of like that. If you think about a year's wage, in today's dollars, even if it's just kind of a middle to low middle income, that still is a lot of money. Jesus doesn't stop her, okay? The wiping it with her hair is a little bit of an odd thing to us. I think it is an act of service, an act of submission. Again, it is a little bit odd to us. He did not seem to think it odd. It's not the only time that this has happened. So maybe it was a tradition of some kind. What does Judas say? Mainly I want to focus on what Judas says. What's Judas say?
Why was this not sold so it could be used as before?
Right. So let's sell it. We could have sold this thing. He knows it's very expensive. And could have sold it for almost a year's wage and could have given the money to the poor. Now we have a parenthetical statement in this where John, again, is writing after the fact, and so we know that he knows. I'm sure at the time it wasn't known about this, although Jesus would have known about it. Look at verse 6. Why did Judas say this? Yeah, he's a thief. Hey, let's put a year's wage. That's a lot of money. Put a year's wage into the money box, into the treasury, and he was carrying the bag or box or whatever it was, and he was stealing some from it. Can't steal what's not there. So there's a lot of, we'll talk about Jesus' response here in just a minute. There's a lot of things we learn about Judas from this situation. Tell me some things that you learn about Judas from this situation, besides the fact that he's a thief. Okay? Yeah, Savannah.
He's
Seems what?
Sneaky.
Yeah. Yeah, sneaky. Carol?
He was not to be trusted.
Not to be trusted. Yep. What else? Greg?
He's in charge of the money.
What?
He's in charge of the money box.
Interesting. He's in charge of the money. He's the treasurer. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the character of Judas here in just a minute. Yeah, Greg.
Even though he should not have been trusted, he was trusted.
Ah,
I think that's what Jacob's back.
right. Yeah. We're going to see that Jesus knows about this, and yet he puts him in a position. He's going to allow him to be in a position to betray him. He has allowed him to do this. Maybe we should talk about why. Why allow him to be in the position that they're talking about if Jesus knows? We don't do that. If we knew somebody was stealing from the treasury, we wouldn't put them in that position. Why do you think Jesus did? Why would you do that? Kind of looks like he doesn't know. We're going to see later that he does know. Yeah, Bill?
I wouldn't say this is why he did it, but what my thoughts are, that Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world. How he viewed things, what was important to Jesus is not the same as it is to us.
Yeah.
And so having a dishonest person in charge of the money, that's not a big deal. There's bigger issues than that,
Okay.
than losing some money. Having someone spend 10 months of wages on a foot cleaning, that's how we look at it, right?
Right.
He looks at it as, no, she's preparing my body for death. The single most important event in human history, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. She's got her priorities right. She doesn't maybe understand that, but he does. And then what's the other thing? Oh, the idea of, saying, you'll always have the poor with you. Some could argue that Jesus didn't care about the poor. He'd rather get this extravagant pedicure, is what we might call it, instead of what could be done. And Jesus, his take on everything is just completely different than how we do it. I'm not saying that's the answer to your question of why we let Jesus do it, but I think we get a really big glimpse into Jesus' thought process, and it should really challenge us to say, why am I so worried about whether this was a good investment or this is a wise application of, maybe we have a little bit of Judas's heart where we're kind of like, we're being selfish, self-centered, thinking about it from our perspective, and not saying, in the big scheme of things, what would Jesus do in this case?
That's a great response, and can take us in a lot of directions. That's really good. That showing Christ's perspective on physical things. My grandfather, some of you knew my grandfather, and he recommended a gospel preacher in Nigeria, and somebody helped support them from United States. It was a small amount, I don't know, 100, 200 a month or something like that. Back then, it probably wasn't that small. And then one day, my grandfather got word that the guy was a thief, and the guy was unworthy and wasn't preaching and was not a good person. My grandfather, with tears, calls this guy up and has to tell him, you've been supporting, maybe for years, a guy who is unworthy. My grandfather was extremely apologetic, and the guy says to him, it's only money. And my grandfather was just struck with the perspective. Again, that's not encouraging wastefulness and not being wise and trying to hold people accountable. But sometimes stuff like this happens, and it causes us to say, it's only a building. It's only carpet, it's only clothes. It helps put, I think, the kingdom of God in perspective about what's really important. This is an excellent perspective on this. There's some other stuff with Judas in this verse as well. Nate, what were you going to say?
God
God uses people with evil intentions throughout the entire Bible to accomplish His will. And there's kind of a weird, maybe way of looking at it, but it was prophesied that He was going to be betrayed. And so, in some ways, I think rather than put that on one of the other apostles who has a good heart, maybe he was looking for somebody with evil intentions or an evil heart to do God's will, which happens a lot in the Bible.
Yep. We're going to see that. I don't know if we'll get to it, but before this happens, Jesus comments on this in John chapter 6. So 6 chapters earlier, you can be turning over there. I think we've commented before about that Jesus isn't hesitant to allow people who are flawed to be around him, even his inner circle. And maybe that helps us as well. We're flawed. Jesus doesn't want me, but he does. Look at the mistakes that these various different people have made. We probably would have made them and more. But at the same time, Jesus can use them in his kingdom. And here is somebody who Jesus from the very beginning knows what kind of heart he has and what he's going to do. Chooses him anyway, can use him anyway. We'll talk on Wednesday more about Judas and free will and some stuff like that. But here's something that's striking to me. Who is sitting at the table with them? Lazarus, who had been raised from the dead, undeniably. Dead for a long time, body stinking, okay? And Judas would know that. It was all around people. All around people had heard about it and believed it. Judas saw miracles. Judas heard the teaching of Jesus. And it didn't change his heart. There are people today who say, if I could see a miracle, then I would believe, or if God would talk to me, just tell me. But I'm telling you, if we have a hard heart, if we have a heart that says, I don't want to believe, or I'm not going to believe, then a real miracle wouldn't change us. This is a warning that we can have a heart where the gospel will bounce off of it, where in the parable of the sower, the seed won't grow, or at least it won't grow to produce fruit in our lives. So yes, the gospel is powerful, but only if we let it grow. Let it grow does not mean, don't ask questions and don't get your questions answered. Resolve your doubts and express them. My sermon's going to talk about that here in a few minutes. But Judas was blinded by some stuff. We see it here. That there was an opportunity for the people to... Lazarus is sitting there, and Jesus is going to make an application of who he is and how he has come to take a radically different view of things. He is headed to Jerusalem to die. And later in the chapter, he's going to predict his own death in verse 27 of chapter 12. The triumphal entry is right there in verse 12. You have the poor with you always. Wait, there's a whole other thing about the poor. What does Judas know about feeding people? I mean, we have the feeding of the 5,000. We have the feeding of the 4,000. We have all of those kind of things. Judas knows that Jesus can feed the poor. He's thinking the wrong way. He hasn't fully accepted who Jesus is. and that hasn't made a change in who he is. That's why Jesus says, you're always going to have the poor, but I'm not always going to be with you. And he starts talking about preparing his body for burial. Try to get the disciples looking at what the most important thing here is. Savannah?
And I think it's interesting that, Jesus knew Judas's heart. He knew, in a way, was kind of using Judas to carry out, the prophecy of his death and resurrection. But I think it's important to note that even though he knew Judas's heart, he didn't push Judas away.
Right.
He didn't say, you're not worthy of my teaching, you're beyond saving. I know what you're going to do, so I'm just going to cast you out from among my 12. He kept him in his inner circle. Whether or not Jesus thought, oh, maybe I can get, if I just do this one miracle, we don't know that. But I think it would have, that is a lot of a better, I guess, message than casting Judas away and saying you're not worthy.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Robin, what were you going to say?
I was just gonna say, it's important to remember that Judas still had a choice. Judas could have done what was right. So it wasn't like he was somehow made to be the kind of person he was, but it was just that Judas knew what kind of person he was, that he was a person without integrity.
Right. And we're going to talk about, not going to have a lot of time today to talk about his character and why he was the way he was. We'll talk about that on Wednesday, but you're right, because I believe that Judas did have a choice. And he made choices that then created a domino effect, not only in his actions, but in his heart. And sometimes we do that.
I think there's a couple of things that I see here. One, if Jesus had surrounded himself with nothing but, quote, perfect people, then later on that could have fed into this bit that Paul refused to. I am a man just like you. People looking up to apostles or certain disciples. It then totally goes against free will as well, but it also sets an example for us. Even somebody that was in his inner circle was somebody that could be tempted by Satan. And we need to take heed lest we fall.
Oh, yeah, that's great. That's great. If these people who are in the inner circle can be tempted, what about us? And I don't know. We just need to heed these warnings. That's a great point, Nate.
I'm sure we'll talk about it more once we actually talk about what he did. But sometimes I think we look at it backwards in a way by saying, like, mentioned every time that Judas is mentioned that he betrayed Christ. And so we think of it as kind of like the ultimate sin or something like that, that like doomed him to hell or something like that, which of course it didn't. Like, I fully think Jesus would have restored him just like he restored Peter. And maybe if he hadn't restored Peter, we would know Peter as the denier, or the one who, it would be like Peter, the one who denied Christ over and over and over again. So we can talk about kind of the free will and stuff, but yeah, like he sinned. And I fully think the response afterwards was fully his choice as well. And Jesus would have been willing to restore it.
Right? Yep. Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. Jake.
Just kind of a continuation too is that, yeah, like, just being someone inside Jesus' inner circle could also sin, and there's a message there. But I think also, like, today, I think that there's this kind of feeling that, like, if Jesus was here today and was doing miracles and we could talk to him and see him, there's no way everyone would believe him. And this is proof that, like, even somebody in his inner circle, right? And I think that it maybe is something that we should look at for our faith to say, even people that were there with him, we're not believing him, and we're betraying him, and we're, things like this.
most of us here, I think, know the end of the story, not only the betrayal and not only that he kills himself, but also I think it's helpful that we know, and the people who wrote these books know, that Judas is going to say, even as bad as we think of him, he's going to say, I betrayed innocent blood. So everybody involved in the death of Jesus, people who denied him, people who betrayed him, people who drove nails, who condemned him, the rulers who condemned him, and even the one who drove nails in his hands said he was innocent. And I think that that's going to be an important thing. When we read, as Jake said, Judas, we instantly think of all of these negative things. The disciples didn't know this. They didn't know it. It was secret. But writing the story, they know it. Why include him in the story? This is embarrassing. This is bad. But he, even the worst that we can imagine someone doing, betraying him like this with a kiss, he's going to say, that was wrong. He was innocent. Somebody who denies him 3 times is going to become one of the most outspoken people, saying that he was innocent and died for our sins. Carrie, what were you going to say?
I was just thinking, like, because he betrayed Jesus, we assign all these other terrible character traits to him. Really, what it tells us is that he was greedy, he put money first. So we saw the miracles. He didn't necessarily believe less than the other apostles. He just chose to put money above everything else, saying when he betrays him, he puts the money above everything else. And I think that we can fall in the same trap where we believe in Jesus, but if we choose to put something else ahead of him first, that's our problem, that's our flaw. Not that we're a bad person, but anytime we prioritize something else first, then that's our downfall.
Yeah, that's a great point. If we prioritize something first, even as a believer, it can be our downfall. I would add to that I really think that if you come to Jesus with something else in mind as well. I'm not saying Judas necessarily did, it kind of feels like that, but if you come to Jesus, I'll tell you, there are some people who come to Jesus because they have a physical thing that's motivating them. If I come to Jesus, I'll find a job. If I pray and worship enough, then maybe he'll answer my prayer about this thing or that thing. So if we come with that kind of thing in our pocket as the motivation, then a lot of times it's our downfall. And we see that with him. And we say, yeah, but if you'd have had a better church or a better preacher, or if you'd have had better leadership or better, classes for this group or that group, then we would have, then they wouldn't have failed. And Judas is like, he's an illustration of somebody who that's not really true. We have some other motivation, some physical motivation particularly, then it can bite us. In John chapter 6, we're not going to have time now to read it, 70 and 71, look at that and be thinking about that for Wednesday. Judas is said to have a demon. Okay, this is pretty early on. And we'll talk about the betrayal. I want you to think about, if he has a demon, well, when did that happen? How much does that affect what he's doing? Anyway, just think about that. It's mentioned more than once in the lesson. So take a look at that before Wednesday, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Talk about the betrayal itself, and then we'll talk a little bit more about free will and prophecy and some things like that. All right, thanks a lot.